Right, and now Patrick to
Okay,
get us going.
I'll try and do it
reflections
in
on that.
5 and be really brief, so that people don't just sit here for an hour being spoken at, but have an opportunity to come back. I'd like to thank Milo and Charles for their presentations. I think there are some really important points that have been flagged. I think it's always good to have the long historical perspective introduced, which I think Charles did very well. I think Milo's points about success and failure largely being determined by how we initially define success and failure in the indicators that we select is a very important point as well. I think it was actually Nancy Birdsall, who I think is also in London this week, who said that the development industry tends to be characterised by episodes of mania and depression in terms of how it thinks about its work. And I think that partly reflects an ambivalence about how best to respond to the very fragile political consensus around development and around aid in donor countries. I mean, on the one hand, if you overplay success, then it can communicate that the job's been done, and if you don't communicate failure, then you don't have the sense of urgency that tends to generate increases in aid budgets. So I think there is something in that, and there are obviously risks of going too far down either route. We can end up with complacency on the one hand, and we can end up with a kind of counsel of despair which paralyses action on the other. And I think Charles is absolutely right that there's been very genuine success. We need to log it, we need to communicate it, we need to learn from it and apply it in order to ensure future development gains. And I think, looking at a couple of areas that are very dear to the work of Save the Children, look at education. 1990, the baseline date for the MDGs, there were 125 million children around the world who were not in primary education. This year, it's about 65 million. If we go back to 1990, there were 12.5 million children dying before their 5th birthday. That's now reduced to 8 million. So we've seen really extraordinary progress in the context of a rapidly growing global population. We've seen significant progress as well in terms of the number of people experiencing absolute income poverty. So we do need to, I think, log these successes and get better at communicating them. I think perhaps part of the difficulty in doing a lot of that communication has been that not all of the success is very obviously attributable to the efforts of the development industry. I think there are some of these wins that we can claim as our own. I think Charles showed the very startling bar chart with the progress of vaccinations, and I think it's very clear that that progress would not have been achieved without the efforts of the development industry. If you're looking at gains in nutritional status or gains in governance, well, I think you could argue that actually that's more down to structural, social and technological and economic changes than it is to anything that Save the Children or the World Bank or DFID or ODI or anybody else represented in this room has actually been doing. So I think we need a bit of modesty, and maybe if just throw the thought out, if we might come to the conclusion that the Chinese Communist Party has been one of the most important development acts of the last 40 years, it might lead us to some very different conclusions about what good development policy looks like. Anyway, I'll leave that there for a moment. I think, notwithstanding all the success, we know there's a big unfinished agenda, and I think Charles himself has acknowledged that. And I think we can see that we are off track globally on most of the MDGs. I know the MDGs were intended as global rather than national or regional targets, but when we do look at sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and there is a risk that the MDGs disguise relative success as failure, but nonetheless there is a concern that on many of the MDGs, Africa's progress is lagging behind that of other regions. We look at an indicator like child mortality. Africa was accounting for about a third of child deaths in 1990. It now accounts for about a half of all child deaths. So there has been a divergence between Africa and other regions on some key human development indicators, not just on income indicators. And we know that, for example, with MDGs 4 and 5 on child and maternal mortality, we've seen about 40% of the progress that we actually need so far. So I think there's certainly genuine progress, but no room for complacency. And I think the question isn't really whether or not there's been success. I think we can all agree that incontrovertibly there has been, but whether with different policy and political choices we could have had a bit more success than we have so far, and also whether the success that we've already logged can be sustained and built upon. And I think there are some concerns there. I think there is evidence that a lot of the MDG progress, both in terms of the countries it's happened in, but also amongst the income groups, social groups that it's happened within, has been largely in relatively easy to reach areas. So a couple of quick examples. Bangladesh made very dramatic progress actually towards MDG4, reducing child mortality. But that progress is starting to slow, and that's partly because what Bangladesh is now facing is the challenge of tackling neonatal mortality, which tends to come down much more slowly than mortality between the period of 1 month and 5 years, and requires much more systemic changes in terms of healthcare delivery and other factors. I think another example would be immunisation. We've seen very dramatic gains in immunisation, but the countries and the income groups that are not being reached by immunisation at the moment are those that are at greatest risk, in most cases, of the diseases being immunised against. We've got I think a very significant challenge that we face collectively in terms of building on and sustaining the success that we've so far had. I think maybe just in terms of looking forward to 2015 and beyond, I think that I'd like to argue that the challenge of development is likely to be much greater in the places that remain poor today than it was in the places that were poor 30 or 40 years ago. The challenges are much more intractable. And it's that group of countries that was shown as the flat line in Charles's early graph, and some other low-income countries that I think are going to face some pretty deep-rooted, multiple interrelated barriers to progress going forward. And I think this kind of poses some challenges to the kind of grand narrative that we've got at the moment about convergence, which a lot of people are arguing has been accelerated by the global economic crisis between developing and developed countries. I think that's true for a number of middle-income countries, a number of emerging economies. It's much less clear that it's true for the least developed countries. And of course that then has all sorts of implications for sustaining support for development going forward. You look at this kind of cluster of countries that have got very poor terms of trade, very high aid dependency, in many cases chronic low-intensity conflict and instability, very low levels of resilience in the face of climate change and economic shocks. So that sets the scene, I suppose, for where we go after 2015. We're going to have a situation, I think, where more poor people are living in middle-income countries than historically has been the case, and where the challenges in terms of poverty reduction are going to be more political than they are resource and capacity-based. I think we're going to see very concentrated deprivation in a much smaller number of least developed countries that are structurally pretty poorly placed at the moment to benefit from the globalised economy. I think we're going to see a reluctance for the foreseeable future on the part of OECD countries to carry the development agenda alone. I think we've seen that partly in the flatlining of aid budgets, but also in the way in which the agenda has moved from the G8 to the G20 on development. I think we're going to see a real challenge of sustaining support for aid when the need for aid is increasingly concentrated in countries where development results are much more difficult to quickly generate. And I think we're going to find it much more difficult to forge agreement on a post-2015 framework in a much more multipolar world, where I think middle-income and low-income country interests are increasingly diverging. And I think there's a big question behind this all, is the extent to which the post-2015 framework is going to be about finishing the job that we started to do with the MDGs, or about a more forward-looking agenda that's about responding to future challenges. So I'll stop there, and that leaves, I think, 5 minutes for questions and answers.
We're going until 2:30.
Okay.